Enlightenment is an era in Western history in which many changes took place in philosophical, intellectual, scientific, and cultural life. This movement took place throughout the 18th century and spanned most of the Western world, including France, England, Germany, Italy, and even into North America. It was heavily influenced by the rise of modern science and by the aftermath of religious conflicts that came about during the Reformation period. Leaders of the Enlightenment movement were known as philosophes and were committed to worldly views based on reason and human understanding, which they believed would lead to beneficial changes for society. The Enlightenment was not a single movement or set of ideas, but more a set of values. It was based on critical questioning of traditional institutions, customs, and morals, and a strong belief in rationality and science. These philosophers were attempting to continue the work of 17th century thinkers such as Galileo, Descartes, and Isaac Newton, who had developed methods of rational inquiry and had worked to show that knowledge was essential for human development. The new Enlightenment philosophers believed that science could unravel nature's mysteries and teach us how to control it. This time period pushed to extend scientific methods into every field of learning and set Western culture on a pathway toward modern social sciences. The period following the Enlightenment became known as modernity, which turned from philosophy and instead emphasized social conditions. During the Enlightenment, women were seen as insatiable, easily swayed, and morally faulty. Their opinions were not highly regarded, and many thought that their place was in the home. However, in the Enlightenment period, women were starting to overcome the idea that they were not worthy as a voice of reason. Women, along with male allies, started to argue that women can use rational thought and can also grow with education. However, men challenged this notion by using science to find ways to disprove the theories that women had a place in society. However, women pushed on and found ways to have their voices heard in the salons of France and the coffeehouses of England. In England, during the 17th and 18th centuries, coffeehouses were public social places in which patrons would gather for conversation and social interaction while drinking coffee, a newly emerging beverage of the time, though other beverages such as tea and chocolate were served as well. For the price of a penny, men bought a cup of coffee and admission to the coffee house, where they would engage in conversation. The coffee houses of the Enlightenment period were also known as penny universities. In England, coffee houses maintained a mostly egalitarian atmosphere, despite the widespread exclusion of women, and became in many ways centers of Enlightenment thinking. In these coffee houses, open discussion and questioning were encouraged. While this intellectual freedom began with reading and discussing the works of others, it often evolved into men sharing their own essays, articles, and ideas. England quickly became passionate about its coffee houses. The first one opened in Oxford in 1650 and then quickly spread. London became the hotspot for coffee houses, with over 2,000 of them in the city alone by the end of the 17th century. Topics discussed within the coffee houses included politics and political scandals, daily gossip, fashion, current events, and debates surrounding philosophy and the sciences. Coffee houses were used as an alternate sphere for intellectual thought to the university, and also often used by political groups as meeting places. It is believed that relative equality existed among patrons of the coffee houses, as people could participate regardless of class, rank, or political leaning. The coffee houses were quite similar to English alehouses, but the absence of alcohol created an atmosphere in which people engaged in sober conversation. English coffee houses acted as public houses in which all were welcome, having paid the price of a penny for a cup of coffee. Conversation was most often polite and civil, as was considered essential. Generally, women were not allowed in coffee houses. However, a few coffee houses were run by women. One such coffee house was held by Elizabeth Montagu, who created the Blue Stocking Society, an informal women's social and educational gathering that emphasized education and mutual cooperation. The term blue stockings referred to the ordinary blue stockings often worn to the gatherings, as opposed to the black dress stockings. This emphasized the informality of the gatherings and the importance of conversation, not fashion. The Russian Baroness Marie von Brunicht hosted a coffee house in St. John's Wood, London, for mostly German refugees of the revolutions of 1848. She was sympathetic with the goals of the revolutionaries, known as the 48ers. The 48ers were Europeans who supported the revolutions of 1848 that favored unification of the German people, a more democratic government, and human rights. The infamous and often satired Moll King took over her husband's rowdy coffee house upon his death, renaming it Moll King's Coffee House. In June of 1739, a riot erupted in Moll King's coffee house, and Moll was fined £200 and sentenced to 3 months in prison. Moll refused to pay the fine on the grounds that it was both excessive and unwarranted, and managed to get it reduced to £50. She continued to run the coffee house for many years. She died in 1747, leaving a large fortune. Moll King's coffee house shows that Enlightenment women were not the timid sex they were made out to be at the time. There were a handful of other instances in which women were allowed into English coffee houses. One example is in Bath, England, where female sociability was more readily accepted, and women could enter coffee houses to partake in business endeavors. Women were also accepted into coffee houses while auctions were held within, as a woman acted in the service of her own household. Not all women were trying to work their way into the coffee houses. In the Women's Petition Against Coffee, women protested against the consumption of coffee, arguing that it made men sterile and impotent, and alleged that it contributed to the nation's failing birth rate. Women also protested against the coffee house itself, claiming that during the times of domestic crisis, they took husbands away from their duties at home. The salon, originally an Italian invention, became famous in France throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. Salons were a gathering of people under the roof of a host, held to increase the participants' knowledge through conversation. The first renowned salon in France was the Hôtel de Rambouillet. Its hostess, Catherine de Vivant, Marquise de Rambouillet, began running the salon in 1607 and is credited for establishing the rules of etiquette of the salon. From here, the salon evolved into a practice that focused on enlightened public opinion by encouraging the exchange of news and ideas. By the mid-18th century, the salon had become an institution in French society and functioned as a major channel of communication among intellectuals. The salons of French Enlightenment were much like English coffee houses in topics of conversation, attendees, and in structure. However, a major difference did occur. Salons differed from other forms of social and intellectual exchange, such as the coffee houses, by gathering the intellectuals on a regular basis in a woman's home. The woman host was known as a salonier. While the leading figures of the French Enlightenment were all men, the social context was usually presided over by a woman, usually of independent wealth. The saloniers were expected, ideally, to run and moderate the conversation. Women were the center of the life in the salon and carried a very important role as regulators. At a time when society was defined and regulated almost completely by men, women could be a powerful influence in the salon. They could select their guest and decide the subjects of the meeting. In some salons, women would even share their own writings with guests. One example is the salon of Madame Lambert. She shared brief essays on friendship, old age, aesthetics, and sets of instructions to her son and daughter. Beginning in 1710, she conducted a salon in her residence, which soon became one of the most intellectually distinguished salons in France. Madame Lambert defended the dignity of women against misogynist stereotypes of opponents of gender equality, and in her writings criticized the unequal distribution of material goods. Prominent salon members included the philosophers Fontenelle and Montesquieu, author of the controversial Persian Letters, which was censored for its religious skepticism. Another important figure of the time that also showed how women held power in the salons is Madame Geoffrin. Madame Geoffrin coined the term donner et pardonner, to give and to be forgiven. She hosted 2 dinners each week and reinvented the salon by moving the meal and meeting time to 1 o'clock in the afternoon from the late dinner hour, allowing the entire afternoon for discussion. She regularly scheduled the salons as the Monday dinner for artists and the Wednesday dinner for the men of letters.
The
English coffeehouse of the 18th century had its counterpart in the French salon. Both were designed to create a public sphere for critical debate. However, they had their differences. The salon was private, held in a house, and admission was by invitation only. The coffeehouse, on the other hand, was public, admitting all kinds of people. It was rough and competitive, and few women went there. However, the advantage of the coffeehouse was that it included a broader range of classes than any invitation-only group of the salons. In comparison, women were not only admitted to many salons, but most salons were controlled and mediated by women's saloniers. While the salon did not bring together the wide range of class and social rank that the coffeehouses did, it was advantageous because it did create a distinctive public sphere that was relatively inclusive for women.